It's my great pleasure this afternoon to get us started with the two things we have. So we've got a panel coming up after this, but we have before that a talk that I am very much looking forward to hearing. And this is Dr. Jennifer Henrichsen. She is an assistant professor at the Morrow College of Communication. She is also involved with CySER as a senior personnel. And there was probably, you may remember, there was a poster that the student has done that she mentored along with a graduate student. And so she's involved with CySER. She is also involved in a number of other things, including, I have to get this one right, an affiliate fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project. And what I remember recently at WC was she was one of the first people to get a Carnegie Fellow to do some research work in helping us understand political polarization. And she's interested in cybersecurity and its intersection with journalism. We will be anchoring the panel later on together, but I am very much looking forward to Jen for your talk now. Take the time.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you again. I was here on Monday. I remember many of you from your presentations. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay, great. Just apologies in advance. I have a little bit of a raspy voice. I'm getting a little bit of a cold, so I'll be taking some water eventually today. As Asafan mentioned, my name is Jennifer Henrichsen, and I'm an assistant professor here at Washington State's Morrow College of Communication. And I'm a journalism studies scholar within the field of communication, so a little bit adjacent to cybersecurity. But as you'll see from my presentation today, I do look at information security in particular. And today I'm going to map how cyber physical precarity is affecting knowledge professions like journalism and what that means for journalism and democracy. Make sure this works. And it has stopped working. So I think perhaps the cursor moved too far away. Okay, there was a video, but it's okay. So most of us are probably familiar with the fact that across the globe, democracies are declining. Show of hands, how many were familiar with that fact? A few of us, okay. On the flip side, authoritarian regimes are increasing. So what you're seeing right now is a map from the Economic Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index. And what it's showing is that the majority of the world's countries are increasingly authoritarian and hybrid regimes. You'll see that the US is now light blue, which indicates that the US is a flawed democracy, which was a demotion that occurred shortly after the 2016 elections. The reason I show this is partly because journalism tends to serve as an early warning system for democratic life. This image, which you see here, and if you can't see it on the far screen, take a look closer, please, is from the Varieties of Democracy Research Project, or VDEM, which shows the top 20 indicators that declined in the largest number of countries during the last decade. What you'll see is that 9 out of the top 20 indicators relate to the freedom of expression component of democracy. If you drill down further in this graphic, you can see that some of the indicators relate directly to conditions of journalistic risk. What I mean by journalistic risk, I'll get into a little bit further later on, but more specifically, I'm thinking about harassment of journalists, media self-censorship, and also government censorship of media. So my research broadly examines 3 main dimensions of journalistic risk: the risks that journalists face, such as external threats of physical abuse or online harassment, and internal threats, such as sexual harassment in newsrooms, the repercussions of this abuse on journalists, and dimensions on journalism. So when I say that, I mean like journalistic autonomy, the audience-journalist relationship, reporting practices, etc., and the societal or institutional structures that are determining conditions for journalistic risk. And what I mean by that is the interactions between journalistic roles and labor precarity within broader social or political dynamics. Now, nestled within this notion of journalistic risk is journalistic precarity, which Siebert defines as the uneven distribution of objective and subjective insecurity in news work. It's a little bit of a mouthful. Let me explain it a little bit more specifically. Objective insecurity is something that you can think of as in terms of structural conditions. So for example, precarious employment. How many of you have heard of journalists losing jobs? Anyone? Raise your hands. Yeah, exactly. Subjective insecurity is kind of what it sounds like. Individual feelings or processes of meaning making. Now, journalistic precarity affects news routines and practices as well as occupational identity, and it really has real repercussions for the broader information environment, which some of us talked about on Monday, as well as the institution of journalism. Now, according to Siebert, who published a dissertation on this in 2024, there are 4 forces that really influence this journalistic precarity. These include industrial, technological, cultural, and political. When we think of industrial within the US context, we can think about the structures of the news enterprise under capitalism. For example, declining resources, deteriorating material conditions. When we think of technological, we can think of operational facets of news work like digitalization, right? How many of you guys get media through your iPhone or your Android, right? Through apps, for example. This has changed news production, it's changed disseminations, also significantly changed consumption of journalism. And by doing so, it's actually challenged core conceptions of what journalism is, its role, and its institutional authority. And artificial intelligence is sort of a supercharger of this as well. Cultural, when I say cultural, I am talking about the meanings that social groups derive from their historical conditions that illuminate the discourses and sentiments over specific periods. And when we think about political dimensions, I'm talking about, as Asifa mentioned at the beginning, political polarization, authoritarianism, ideological extremism, some things that we also heard on Monday in your projects. So these 4 forces, industrial, technological, cultural, and political, are intertwined to some degree, right? They're not separate necessarily. And they also shape the current environment facing journalism. Today, I'm going to specifically focus on one with the understanding that they're all intertwined, okay? And that's the technological dimension. And this is the technological dimension within journalistic precarity. It's something that I call the cyber-physical precarity of journalists because it involves both digital and physical abuse. Now, unfortunately, cyber-physical precarity of journalists is increasing and it's intensifying. And today's talk, I'm going to share a bit of my larger book project with you, which examines why journalists and news organizations are reluctant to adopt protective technologies despite this increasing cyber-physical precarity and what we can do about it. And what I find is that there are competing institutional logics that reward maintaining the status quo while simultaneously signaling security to enhance external legitimacy to various audiences. Another way to think about that is a paradox of stasis and change, okay? And this has important implications for journalism as well as democratic governance. Why do you think that is? Because journalism has long held the normative role of holding powerful interests and actors to account. That is sort of a central condition of journalistic work in the Western conceptions of journalism. So in my book, which I'm talking about today, I chart a way forward through a discursive process known as securitization. So adapted from Waiver, I argue that securitization reflects 3 aspects of adaptation pertaining to information security. And this includes obstacles, motivating factors, and the resolution between them. So before I get to that, I want to paint the picture of cyber-physical precarity for you. And at the most basic level, the way to do that is to talk about how journalists are being killed around the world for their work. So this is a picture of one of my first books called War on Words, Who Should Protect Journalists? And in it, my co-author and I found that local journalists around the globe are more at risk than foreign correspondents, which to us was a little bit of a surprise because what you hear in the media are the deaths of foreign correspondents. And this is because they aren't able to easily leave the context when a situation deteriorates, right? They have families, they have lives, they have habits, etc. Additionally, the murders of journalists tend to go unpunished, which means there's little accountability or deterrence. At the same time, current safety strategies are insufficient. And unfortunately, and I just updated this number last night, the physical safety of journalists is deteriorating. In fact, over the past few years, we've seen that the most journalists killed in any particular conflict to date. So 264 journalists have been killed in the Israel-Gaza war since October 2023. So rather than going down, we see an uptick, right, in journalist deaths. You would think that this wouldn't be the case, and yet here we are. Journalists also face significant digital safety issues. In my report for UNESCO, which involved a survey and interviews with journalists, technologists, and NGO leaders, my co-authors and I mapped the digital safety landscape facing journalists around the globe. And we found myriad challenges, which won't be a surprise probably to many of you in this room. Disinformation campaigns, denial of service attacks, hardware and software exploits, online harassment, which were disproportionately gendered, phishing campaigns, and surveillance. And these safety threats are intensifying as technologies become more ubiquitous and networked. So previously, journalists appeared more at risk by nation state or parastate actors, but now journalists are subjected to what's called mob censorship. Has anyone heard that term before today? Mob censorship? So this was coined by scholar Sylvia Weisbord, who defines it as, quote, citizen vigilantism aimed at disciplining and silencing journalists. And so essentially it's like the everyday citizen going online, attacking journalists in order to silence them, discipline them, and get them offline. It's not only mob censorship though, it's also legislative attacks. So I have a new book that is under contract with Routledge. And this is looking at how nation states and wealthy individuals are increasingly trying to weaponize the law now against journalists through spurious defamation claims or by creating cybercrime legislation that harms journalism. And this is happening writ large too across the world. So this will come out next year. Super interesting, super worrisome. I've talked about nation states, I've talked about citizens. This is a little bit more abstract, but I want to bring it up because it's also important. I've also found that press coverage and normative news gathering practices about journalist killings can contribute to inadvertent complicity with systemic violence. This might be interesting more to the moral philosophy folks in the room. And that this coverage can actually re-victimize journalists through denials and dehumanization, constituting what's called discursive violence, which is essentially discourse that causes further harm. Okay, so that's a lot of information around the risks that journalists face. I want to talk a little bit about the repercussions of abuse on journalists. If we think about that second category of risk that I presented in the beginning, that's about the repercussions. And this is important because it's not only from the individual level, right? Mental health crises, self-censorship, journalists departing from the field, but it's also bigger than that. Journalists are leaving the profession. There are impacts on democratic life. You have changes in the audience-journalist relationship, which basically means you are as the audience, you as the consumers of information, and also the broader relationship between freedom of expression and democracy. So in a special issue that I'm doing for a journal called Digital Journalism, we're looking at the impacts of digital violence on journalists and the harms to society. And we found that the impacts are profound. So these go beyond immediate physical or digital threats to encompass long-term harm. Journalists are subjected to sustained and escalating online harassment, and they often report symptoms of anxiety, depression, trauma. Professionally, they may experience self-censorship, limited digital publicity, or they may remove themselves from the field. And these outcomes damage both the journalist, like I said, but they also have these broader implications for the quality of journalism and the sustainability of it as a profession, as well as for press freedom in democratic and non-democratic countries. The third dimension that I want to talk about today as it relates to journalistic risk is the societal and institutional structures on journalism practices and roles. So this is comes from a regional report covering Western Europe and North America. And in it, I found that societal structures play a role in journalistic risk. So for example, this shouldn't be a surprise, but a heightened climate, for example, of populism and nationalism and governmental measures to monitor so-called fake news can impede media independence. That makes sense, right? At the same time, media concentration, media convergence, and media capture indicate risks to media pluralism, media independence, and media freedom, which are really important for a holistic society. At the same time, you have conditions that are being difficult for or are increasing risks to journalism safety, such as political turmoil, violent groups, and verbal attacks. Similarly, in this book that I did with Columbia University Press, there have been particular historical events like the Snowden revelations, which have underscored how the political, institutional, and physical infrastructure of surveillance can impact journalism practice. How many people are familiar with the Snowden revelations? Okay, so like half maybe? That's so fascinating as a professor to like see the changes, over time. For example, state surveillance can increase the technical challenges of carrying out journalism safety and securely communicating with sources. And mass surveillance and the use of the Espionage Act to chill national security reporting can curtail the constitutionally held rights of a free press. At the same time, intensifying and ubiquitous surveillance technologies, strategic disinformation, a climate of information warfare, and at the same time, an influx in information and information disseminators are challenging both journalism and usurping traditional journalistic roles. So the reason I'm painting this picture, these different conditions of journalistic risk, is because they're concurrently facilitating a broad rise of what scholars have called digital repression. Digital repression is the use of information and communications technology to surveil, coerce, or manipulate individuals or groups in order to deter specific activities or beliefs that challenge the state. It's also occurring increasingly transnationally, so essentially regardless, right, of nation-state borders, geographic borders. And that's a problem. At the same time, we are reliant on digital technologies that generate data and metadata about ourselves, our networks, our locations, and our habits. That in turn implicates key tenets of journalistic practice and just communication with one another, which in turn affects how journalists communicate with sources to obtain information, which help to hold powerful interests and actors to account. If we go back to the beginning of the talk where I talked about journalism's role in a democracy, what one of the main aspects of it is. And yet, while we are reliant on digital technologies that generate this data and metadata about ourselves, we know that journalists as collectors, curators, and disseminators of information are at heightened risk for potential observation and investigation by powerful entities. And yet protective strategies remain nascent or non-existent. So several years ago, in my capacity as a research fellow at Columbia University's Tao Center, I worked with the Pew Research Center to create a survey focused on US investigative journalists and digital security. And I found, surprisingly, that 80% of investigative journalists in the US who were surveyed believe that merely being a journalist may increase the likelihood that the US government will collect their data. More surprisingly to me was that 50% of journalists indicated they do not use any digital security tools to protect their information. In addition, the majority of journalists have not received formal training or instruction about digital security, and only 27% of journalists surveyed had spent some time in the past 12 months researching how to improve it. So at the time, this survey was the first of its kind, and I haven't been able to replicate it, unfortunately, because we haven't had the funds. But there have been other surveys out there that validate basically what we've found with other populations. So for example, in 2024, Internews surveyed 122 journalists across Central and Southeastern Europe and found that 74% of surveyed journalists agree that they could face risks to their digital safety because of their work. At the same time, like before, more than half of the journalists surveyed said they had insufficient knowledge about digital security. And let's say you think, oh, well, maybe that's because the journalists are over in a different location and not US. Not true. So I did a survey last year, 2024. I conducted the survey in 2024. And at the local level in Washington State, and I found that 66% of the news organizations said that journalists at their organization had experienced safety or security challenges in the past 5 years. That's pretty high. These are local news organizations. These are like the Spokesman Review, the Seattle Times, places that you wouldn't think would get much vitriol. Most common was online harassment by far. Second most common was disinformation campaigns. That was super interesting to me. So we had managers and editors explaining to me that local politicians were leading disinformation campaigns against them because they didn't like their reporting. So it went from a nation state level down to the very local level with different actors being upset about reporting. So what these surveys and these preliminary findings show, therefore, is that although journalists may feel that carrying out their work make them more vulnerable to information security concerns, this belief has not inspired significant behavior change around adoption of protective technologies. And I should note in the Washington State survey, most people, as I interviewed managers, editors, et cetera, had no security policies. They may use a VPN, but in general, they didn't have anything sort of embedded, holistic in their news organization. So I wanted to understand this paradox. So I decided to investigate it further with this book under review, and I wrestle with key questions related to journalism and information security. And these questions, more specifically, are looking at why are journalists and news organizations reluctant to engage in protective technologies, even as attacks against journalists increase? And amidst this rising cyber-physical precarity, which I talked about at the beginning of the talk, is how can information security be integrated into journalism effectively? And this is partly why I was so interested in your presentation on Monday, because you were talking about how do we build sort of resilience, right? Or like training around like AI, right? How do we build that into everyday structures? How do we build information security in journalism amidst all these risks that they're facing? Okay. Now, I would be remiss as an academic if I didn't define key terms. So let me briefly describe and define information security. By information security, I mean the protection of information and information systems from unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction in order to provide confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I'm sure all of you have heard that numerous times. But also because information security is not an individual level issue, even though it's treated like that in many cases, especially in news organizations. Rather, it's a networked and institutional one. I, in my research, have been also interested in understanding information security cultures. And when I brought that up to people in the newsroom, they're like, what? What does that mean? Is that like a made-up term? No, it's not. Information security cultures are the shared pattern of values, mental models, and activities that are traded among an organization's employees over time, affecting information security. So to answer these questions, like any good academic, you need to have a theoretical frame to anchor your work. So I use the theoretical frame of new institutionalism because it provides a sociological view of institutions, and it illuminates how they interact, how it can influence human behavior, and how they aim to gain legitimacy and survive within a world of other institutions. And that's important because journalism is often considered a democratic institution within this broader umbrella of democracy, okay? And within new institutionalism, there's a concept of institutional isomorphism. That's a mouthful. Or when institutional fields mirror dominant practices and forms to avoid claims of negligence and to gain public legitimacy. I'm going to talk a little bit more about institutional isomorphism. So this occurs through three mechanisms of change: coercive, mimetic, and normative pressures. Okay, stay with me. Coercive isomorphism is often associated with regulative pressures. When we think about regulative pressures, we can think of formal rules, we can think of laws, right? Things that kind of guide our behavior. Okay. Mimetic pressures, or mimicry, are visible when organizations engage in activities or behaviors to imitate peers because people want to be like them, right? Peers are perceived as influential or successful. It's like in middle school when somebody's wearing like the right shoe and everybody wants to wear that same brand, right? It's kind of like that, but at the institutional level. Also, normative isomorphism. This is when organizational change primarily occurs through professionalization, such as on-the-job training or through formal journalism education. A couple more concepts that are important here include institutional entrepreneur, who is essentially an individual capable of sparking institutional change for a few reasons. They are creative individuals, they have social positions and skills that allow them to recognize problems or opportunities, and thus take advantage of enabling conditions to create change, to alter the social order. So that's a pretty cool option within a news organization. And decoupling. And this is when organizations seek to achieve institutional legitimacy by engaging in superficial change or action, but they still do the same stuff. So they don't actually change, right? So it's decoupled. Interestingly, little academic attention has actually focused on the interplay between these two concepts of decoupling and institutional isomorphism. And so in this work that I'm talking about today, I address how these two forces intersect and how these reveal the dueling environments within news organizations. So to investigate these two research questions, I conducted 79 semi-structured interviews with journalists and editors, technologists, journalism professors, et cetera. And they came from a wide variety of organizations. So I wanted to make sure that I didn't only talk to the New York Times, but I also talked to hyper-local organizations in Washington, for example. I interviewed 45 men, 34 women. They identified as white, Black, or Latinx. Each interview lasted about 46 minutes. And I selected the subjects via a snowball sample. And that's because these conversations required amount of trust. And a snowball sample essentially is, as I ask someone, I give them an interview or I do an interview with them. I say, who do you think I can talk to next? They give me a name, they connect me to that person. So there's automatically this trust, right, that's being built because of the sensitivity of topics. So broadly speaking, what did I find? I found three main obstacles to information security integration into news organizations. These included occupational disinterest toward information security, mental models, which I'll go in depth in a minute, and commercial logics. So for this first one, I found that security is perceived as an individual responsibility and not a collective one. One information security trainer said, people are not necessarily always plugged into this idea of security being everybody's job. Has anyone come across that in their work? Yeah. Nor have they internalized the notion that everyone with access to digital and physical assets has a shared responsibility. So the privileging of the individual over the collective can be problematic because information security cultures, because reporters like all of us are reliant to an extent on networked infrastructure. If a journalist clicks on a phishing email by accident, right, that could have repercussions for the larger newsroom. Relatedly, journalists and management also have a reactive orientation to security concerns. So a security trainer talked about how it's a reoccurring pattern in newsrooms where management, by management, I mean like editors or top officials in news organizations, get together to address how to prevent something bad from happening again once it's already happened. So it's not a proactive approach. But this reactive posture has implications. So a journalist who had been harassed for more than a year following the publication of an investigative database that she spent a lot of time on, said she didn't know at what point to be really scared. She expected management to come up with a plan and have that in place when the harassment crossed the threshold, but that didn't happen. She said something really bad needs to happen for people to take it seriously. And she called it incompetent management. She said she felt okay with her direct manager, but above that, where decisions were being taken, basically no one cared. So this reactive orientation between journalists and management points to an ongoing tension between journalistic practice and security implementation. What do you think that tension is? It's basically this notion that security is still external to journalism. It's like, we don't have to care about this. It's still external to the domain of journalism. It's not prioritized until after an incident occurs. We'll see this too in mental models. So the second category of obstacles are mental models. How many people have heard of mental models in like literature? Yeah, one? Okay. That's interesting because there's like folk models, mental models, lots of interesting things as it relates to users' understanding of security. Anyway, I'll talk about two. So what I found was journalists tend to hold a perception that they don't need to be concerned about information security unless they are reporting on something that's obviously interesting to the government, which is interesting. Like, how do you know, right? One media lawyer said, who advises journalists in the newsroom, the vast majority feels like nobody's out to get them. They're not doing anything that's important. Even the ones that are doing sensitive stuff feel like they're generally protected. So this belief, this mental model, is known as the security by obscurity mental model, in which journalists feel like they have nothing to worry about as long as they don't report on topics that might generate interest among powerful interests or powerful actors. Okay. The second mental model is a security by insularity mental model. And I found this with journalism educators, so journalism professors, and journalism students. And this model basically says that journalists believe they are insulated from risk because they are journalists working in a democracy. Maybe they're working as students in a university. And there's normative expectations that they are protected. They also probably haven't yet experienced a digital attack and thus maintain a reactive posture. One journalist said, and security trainer said, security is a really easy thing to overlook, especially if you haven't had a breach, if you haven't been intimately involved in wide-scale harassment or doxing or swatting. People think the stakes are really low, and they're wrong. The third category of obstacles is this competing institutional logics section. So basically what this means is that there are different dimensions of practice that can hinder security adoption. As one media lawyer put it, you want ease of use, right? That makes sense. You want to be able to do your job easily, but you also want security, and those things can work against each other. So you're going to have to compromise on one or the other. Think about being a journalist. What do you think the number one thing is that you have to do as a journalist? Think about like what's one of the main pressures that you have as a journalist? Yeah. Yeah, you have to have access. That's true. And some like confidence, I guess, to go up to that person. But you're also operating in a really time like sensitive environment. You have deadlines that are super fast and you're trying to beat other news organizations to the story, right? So if you're focused on getting a story out, are you going to take multiple security precautions when another entity might not be doing so? Probably not. So that's what I mean by competing institutional logics. Additionally, one security technologist said, as it pertains to sources, you have to walk this line between having sources use something that's digitally safe or encrypted or whatever without scaring them off or freaking them out, right? You're also reliant, not only do you have to have confidence to go up to that powerful individual and get them to say something to you, but you also are reliant on other sources, right? And so you don't want the source to say, oh, I don't want to talk to you because I don't know how to use Signal, right? So this is a real issue. Additionally, which was sort of surprising, there's actually conflicts between IT and journalism too. So the IT department within a news organization is not necessarily as knowledgeable about specific security practices as you might think. So if some journalists have been advised by outside security experts to use certain technologies like Tor or something like that, and then the internal IT team's like, you can't use that. What happens is you have a shadow IT culture develop where you have journalists go rogue and just do whatever they want. What's the problem with that? If you have a bunch of people not listening to IT and probably not implementing stuff correctly according to the outside security expert, you're probably introducing a lot of vulnerabilities into your networked infrastructure, right? So that's also an issue. Additionally, it shows that security is outsourced within the news organization, that it's secondary, that it's peripheral, right? And that actually it aligns with how innovations in journalism historically have occurred. So this is not completely novel, but it is problematic. One good thing, I've talked a lot about bad things, is that when I listen to journalists talk about journalism, particular news flashpoints, particular critical incidents, which brought security concerns to the fore, motivated journalists and news organizations to do something about this. Now, when I say news flashpoints, I mean sudden and brief periods when interest in specific topics rise and fall rapidly across network journalism. So I'll give an example of what an example of that is. But basically, I mentioned the Snowden revelations. Some people said they didn't know what those were. If you don't know what they were, I'm not going to talk about it right now, but you can look them up. But they were big in the field of journalism at the time. The DNC hacks. Anyone remember the DNC hacks? We have some folks, yeah. And those types of incidents that were sort of game changer incidents because they became major sites of what scholars call meta-journalistic discourse. What is that? It's basically when journalists talk about journalism, but they're important because they are events that force members of the journalism community to reflect on its collective practices, negotiate boundaries, and protect its ranks. So this discourse provides cues to what journalists are thinking and how they think about journalism. And that discourse, in turn, consolidates them as what's called an interpretive community. It provides opportunities for enhanced autonomy and legitimacy. So that might be the point in which you can get journalists to care about information security. It can provide opportunities for both enhanced autonomy, enhanced legitimacy, and thus offer a way out of this impasse that I've talked about at length, right? All these occupational disinterest, obstacles, and other things. So the discourse reveals that change is possible. And to bring it back to new institutionalism, I found that the discourse was revealed isomorphic pressures, okay? So these were occurring at those three levels that I talked about before: coercive, normative, and mimetic. In coercive pressures, even though normally they're thought of as laws or regulatory frameworks, they can also be sources, which is super interesting. I found that journalists were more willing to engage with encrypted technologies, especially following the Snowden revelations, which was a news flashpoint and a critical incident for journalism, if the source said that they would not talk to the journalist without using an encrypted technology, right? So one journalist said their desire to include encrypted contact information on their social media profile was to assure their future and potential sources, whoever they may be out there, that they took information security seriously. They said it was like a bat signal. Hey, you can come to me, you can trust me because I understand this information security stuff. So that's an example of coercive isomorphism. It required journalist behavior to change because they want the source's information. So the source was forcing the journalist to change, which is pretty cool. Mimetic isomorphism, is also on display because journalists and news organizations' desire and willingness to adopt what was known as a anonymous whistleblowing submission platform called SecureDrop. Raise their hands. How many people have heard of SecureDrop? One? Okay. So initially this was rolled out in 2013. Not many news organizations adopted it. 2016 rolls around, specifically the presidential election, and a whole bunch of news organizations said, "Ooh, maybe we should get this for our news organization." So people can like send us documents, send us information anonymously through Tor, not be, found, etc. Now, more than 65 news organizations globally have it installed. And one of the reasons for this is that it's typically a one-time investment. So one journalist said, it's like installing a ramp at the entrance of your newsroom. Once it's there, it's there. You don't have to spend money on it, really. You don't have to think about it too much, right? It's mostly there. Additionally, it serves as a signal to audiences and potential sources that the news organization takes security seriously. But something that has come up in the survey that I recently did is that the adoption of SecureDrop without these other institutionalized security practices reveals a legitimacy gap. Okay? Because you can have this outward-facing presentation of security, but you're not necessarily doing anything internally to make sure sources are safe. And that's not good, right? So one social actor trying to fill that gap is a grassroots institutional entrepreneur. I'm calling the security champion. And these are individuals who care about information security. They live all across the newsroom. It's not necessarily only national security or investigative. It's really anyone who cares about security and then says to themselves, I'm going to learn more about this. I'm going to teach other people in my news organization. I'm going to host a brown bag session to get other people up to speed. These folks are trying to level up their news organizations. And they're helpful to resolving journalism's resistance to information security, in part because it's a peer-to-peer discussion. And journalists sort of historically learn from their peers. They trust their peers because they understand the environment in which they're operating. Okay. So one person said, we need to find, one information security trainer said, we need to find a couple people to buy into what we're doing on that specific desk. By desk, it just means beat, basically, like national security, before we make real progress with that team when they don't already have that culture of security mindedness. So this is an example of normative isomorphism because it's part of that on-the-job training and that pressure and professionalization. But it's not a total solution, right? Can you think like these just individuals trying to like level everybody up through brown bag sessions? Well, that's not going to work completely. Why is that? Well, part of it is because they're not security professionals. So you have data journalists, you have some people who learned about security in their free time, but they're not necessarily really trained or really knowledgeable holistically, right? So one person said, IT and data journalists are not information security experts, but in your average news organization, they're the closest thing. That's what people believe, but it's not the right shape to go through that hole. It's not correct mapping at all. But it's like the best they have right now. And that remains true. It might be more true today than it was when that quote first occurred. So what does this all mean? It basically means that this uneven and patchworked approach to the development of security cultures in newsrooms is emblematic of something larger. It's emblematic of the intransigence of journalism as an institution. And why is that? Because it reveals how, despite increasing and intensifying threats, which I talked about at the beginning, there's still this resistance to engaging in practices around information security. And yet, as I also showed at the beginning, it's urgent to find a way to offset this intransigence because strong and independent journalistic institutions are necessary for democracy. And we know from that report at the beginning that democracies are declining. As democratic backsliding and constitutional rot occurs, press protections tend to weaken. As trust in democracies decrease, trust in specific democratic institutions like journalism also decrease. Similarly, reduced trust in journalism can contribute to a more hostile environment facing the press. And yet, as I showed at the beginning, the press is experiencing an extremely hostile environment. As hostility increases, journalists may withdraw from social media platforms that provide space for the cultivation of new networks, peer sharing, visibility for their work, because it's just not worth it for them. It's not worth it for their families. It's not worth it to them. And yet those responses contribute to an environment of increased censorship and a situation where the journalist has limited digital publicity, which basically means they dial back their social media presence and they're not as visible online. And that matters because sources may not be able to find them. Sources may self-censor, the journalist may self-censor. In turn, you have a climate where there's not as much information out there. And that's problematic for democracy. So what I'm proposing to move us forward is a concept of securitization, which is a process that reflects three aspects of adaptation: obstacles, motivating factors, and the resolution between them. Okay. So I show how obstacles, those occupational disinterests, the mental models, and also the commercial logics impede the understanding of information security and its relevance to journalism. I also talk about the motivating factors, right? That professional push for autonomy and legitimacy, the consolidation of journalists as an interpretive community, and the gains that arise from discussion of news flashpoints and critical incidents. So those elements work against occupational disinterest, mental models, etc., and they push for the inclusion and integration of information security in journalism. So resolution of the impasse of information security in journalism occurs when the factors motivating journalists to adopt information securities outweigh the obstacles to do so. And that resolution involves the activation of specific isomorphic pressures of mimetic, coercive, and normative nature, including the advent of the security champion, so that normative pressure element, who can help to change thinking and action around information security and journalism. So in this way, information security acts as an umbrella condition for the numerous risks afflicting journalism today, and can also encourage a broader debate about the various frictions affecting journalism as an institution in this increasingly volatile and problematic environment. So by employing the concept of securitization, we can actually show how obstacles and motivations are forming the nodes by which journalists both resist and also repudiate intransigence toward information security in journalism. So it offers a path forward out of this problem. And because journalism's reluctance to change the status quo parallels this fragility facing democratic institutions more broadly, it may be that solving the indifference to information security can act as an exemplar for journalism's adaptation to change more broadly, which, as we can see today, is a challenge made urgent by current and ongoing threats to the modern political project of liberal democracy. So with that, I'll conclude, and I welcome your questions. Okay.
You can go ahead and ask questions.
That's so fun.
All right. My question was on what are your thoughts with the growing almost fog of information and a lot of conflicts? Like it started with Ukraine and Russia, where you're getting bot accounts on both sides pressing just disinformation constantly, and it's hard to figure out the truth there. And you can see the same in the Middle East with like Israel and in the Gaza conflict, where the truth is hard to get out, and also each government wants to fight for the people's opinion. And especially in America, if the people support or don't support a country, that can cut off their support. So
I mean, I think it underscores the importance of good journalism, right? So like what I've been trying to talk about today is at its fundamental, like its normative aspect of holding powerful interests and actors to account. And yet, as we see in this fractured information environment, good journalism kind of gets left behind because of this polluted information ecosystem. You said it's new. It's not new. It's intensifying. But it's always been an issue to some extent, right? And that's partly what makes journalism powerful, is because political actors want public opinion to be favorable to them so that they stay in power. So what I would say is that there needs to be more investment and support and understanding of good critical journalism in order, writ large, with like international bodies and support of that, to make sure that they're protected when they are in these conflict spaces. And actually, technically, under international, I don't know how specific you want me to get here, but like under international humanitarian law, journalists are protected as civilians as long as they don't engage in hostilities, which basically means as long as they have, they don't even have to have press on them, but oftentimes they do. As long as they don't carry a weapon, they are protected under IHL, and they should not be targeted. That's a war crime. And yet what you see is that's happening with frequency. So what you have in response is journalists don't wear a press badge in some cases to try to be out of the line of fire. And yet they're still hurt. They're still killed in a lot of cases. So there you have political will being a problem. And you also need to decrease impunity. And so there are some organizations trying to do that by documenting it, like the Committee to Protect Journalists, which I mentioned at the start. They had the statistic of journalists killed since 1992. I used the statistic that's more modest, in that it's motive confirmed that they're journalists and that's why they were killed, and journalists. It goes up by over 1,000 if I included motive unconfirmed and media worker. Okay. But so those are like nonprofit organizations that are advocating for the safe passage of journalists in areas like, conflict areas, for example. So I think it just underscores the importance of really good journalism, but also underscores the importance of other actors, NGOs, intergovernmental organizations supporting media pluralism and media independence. that answer your question?
Yeah.
Hi, yes, similar to what you were saying about the journalists wearing vests
Yeah.
or not wanting to wear vests in some situations, do you feel that as some journalists adopt some of these security practices, that they might draw more attention to themselves from state actors?
Yes. Yes, that's a great question. And it's interesting because it brings me back like 10 years when I was talking to journalists in very obvious authoritarian contexts where they were asking me for guidance on like how they should not stand out and still be secure. And I was like, well, in your particular context, the way to be secure and not stand out is actually to use a Gmail address because everybody uses a Gmail address. So there is truth to making sure that your context, like you have to make sure that your context is known and like you adopt the steps necessary for that and not make yourself more overtly a target. It's such a difficult thing for journalists because they have to be public facing. And so sometimes when I talk to like really hardcore information security technologists, they're like, do these 50 things and then never go online. And I'm like, but the journalist has to, like, I mean, I get it, but it has to be reasonable to their threat level, to their threat assessment. It has to change depending on their story. Are they traveling to China? Where are they going? You know what I mean? So yes, some things can make them stand out more. You have to be really specific about the context when giving the advice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned like this idea of like a security champion.
Yeah.
Do you think this is like best implemented by like individuals at these companies or at with these like press companies or like is this like a good place for like a business, like to like standardize that across the industry?
That's a great question. I mean, what I showed is what exists. It's very piecemeal. So I don't think it's either or, actually. I think as long as you have folks who are holistic in their knowledge, then adding layers, right? Building resiliency in processes is the best way to go. There are, this is interesting. Just today, there's something called ACOS Alliance, which is like a safety and security alliance for news organizations. They just announced today this AI chatbot, I guess, to give personalized advice to journalist security concerns. And it's trying to scale across news organizations that don't have money, this personalized feedback. And it says in like the press release, it will be privacy enhanced. And I'm just like, okay, like I want to know more about the back end of this. So I think that maybe there is room for an organization to specify in this area, but you also have to understand the culture of these news organizations. So I remember I was talking to, I think, a media lawyer at the New York Times, and he was telling me that some of the best, because they have more money than most news organizations. So they actually had an information security team, which is very cool. They had like the first information security director, and then they have information security analysts, and like, it's great. They talk to legal, they talk to the physical safety folks. Like, it's really, really great. And that's an anomaly. But they were telling me, I think that it was so difficult culture-wise to have someone come in to the news organization from the FBI than it was to have a different type of physical safety type person enter the news organization. They didn't give me a good example of somebody that worked, but they gave me an example of somebody that didn't quite work. And I don't know if it was just the personality of that person, but that was like their presentation of the information to me. And I remember being like, oh, okay, it's very specific. News organizations are idiosyncratic to an extent. Each place has a different type of culture, and that culture changes depending on who's in leadership and who's in, the staff, et cetera. But I would like to just see more safety and security knowledge, writ large. And I'm hopeful that maybe it's coming in these different ways, but I think we'll have to see. So my first thought when that came out was like, oh, I need to study this, like we'll see how this works, right? But at the same time, you have to have this level of trust to have people talk to you. And thankfully, like within Washington, I have a lot of contacts. So that has worked out fairly well. But in other places, like if you don't already have existing like networks, people are very reticent. Like I have this project that we originally started as encrypted tip lines, where we were trying to talk to folks about like how they get sources. And I thought this was a great idea, like what kinds of encrypted mechanisms do you use to get sources? What have been effective, what have not been effective, and why? And like no one would respond to us. And I was like, what? We're like legit, And then I'm like, oh, it's so sensitive. Of course they don't want to talk, especially not over the phone, maybe like in person or something. So anyway, I'm digressing a lot. So I'll stop there.
Oh, that was very good. Thank you.
Good.
Make that one the last question so that we don't run into things on this. We will sit there and we'll be